Can you hear me, Jamie? We good? No?
No.
All right. Sure. Be great. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Appreciate it. I'm going to go through some technical stuff today. And so, if there's questions or anything, just let me know and I'll slow down a little bit. As I got into this, my vision or my view of the flood over the years is so wrong. It might be the same with you of how it occurred and how God initiated it and what happened. And so I'm going to get into some geology and stuff like that. You can bring that back from when you were kids. And so if there's questions, please stop me, okay? All right, we'll do a little review real quick. Last week, the antediluvian world, it was a temperate but a difficult world. Remember, we still have the vapor canopy. It's warm, it's nice and everything, but everything's out of control in terms of growth of the plants. And there's evil. Every animal is afraid now. It's everyone for themselves, basically. And probably every human's afraid as well. Adam and Eve raised their family at the gate, garden gate. That's going to play into tonight, believe it or not. That's an important thing. So they raised their family there. They raised them to honor God. Cain brought a offering, as did the other children. So they raised their family in this way. They were devout, and they stayed near the gate to be as close to God as they could. The Shekinah glory, God's physical manifestation, is at the gate, and so they stayed nearby. We know Cain defies God, commits murder, is banished. The Cainites descend deeper and deeper into darkness, generation to generation. The evil gets so bad that God finally wipes out the planet with flood. Their third son, Adam and Eve's, Seth, carries on the messianic line, of which Noah is part. God's grieved by all this evil, and he takes some action. He finds only Noah righteous, tells him to build an ark. And Noah does, he obeys. He and the animals are on it when we left last week, right? They're ready to go. The door has been sealed by God. And we're waiting for the greatest cataclysm ever to hit the planet. So that's what we're going to go through now. You ready? Some geology. So here's the world. And you might remember seismology, seismic waves through the earth. We can tell there's different parts of it, different intersections of materials and things. It's cool, dense and rocky. And then as we progress towards the center, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. A lot of that heat inside is from creation. They think it was 4.5 billion years ago. We say it was 6,000 years ago. Okay, we talked about, I think in session 1 or 2, God probably used controlled nuclear fusion to create the earth on day 3. A lot of heat, that heat's still in the center of the planet. Also, there's friction going on as denser materials work their way through towards the center, and that creates heat. And then we have radioactive decay, like uranium produces heat. We have a lot of that in the planet. So that's causing that. The density in the center is very high. The density on the outside surface is pretty high. Not as high as in the middle. And then in between, it's not very dense. So we're going to talk about that. Oh, by the way, in this outer layer, the crust, very thin, this is all we've really ever explored of the planet. The deepest hole we've drilled is 7.5 miles, and it took 20 years to drill that hole. So we've just really pinpricked the planet in terms of actually physically going somewhere and getting information. So most of the information is from this seismology, sending sound waves through and seeing how they bounce back. Underneath the crust, and this is surprising, we have two things. The lithosphere is attached to the crust, and it's rocky and dense, but warm, okay? The crust is cool. And then under it is the asthenosphere. Asthenos means without strength, okay? It has no strength. It flows. It's like peanut butter, chunky style. And so we're actually floating right now on a surface of chunky peanut butter. Some faces up here. It's not actual peanut butter. It's just of that consistency with some chunks in it. Okay? So, we feel like we're anchored. Well, our homes are anchored to, material that's on the crust. But under the crust, we're floating. There's possibility of movement. Then we have the mantle, very thick, okay, 1,800 miles. And it's pretty dense, but it's not as dense as that lithosphere in the crust is. And that's going to play a big role tonight as we get into the dynamics of the flood. This density difference. Then we have the outer core and the inner core. This is largely iron. The outer core is liquid, molten. The inner core is solid, but it's hotter. The reason that it's not liquid, it would be if it wasn't for the tremendous pressure. So we have so much weight, the force of gravity, that the iron can't melt at a certain point, even at the elevated temperature, the more central part of the world. Okay, so those are the basic elements of the planet. Below that lithosphere in the crust, we think, as creation scientists, it's basically the same as what's been described here. Okay, we don't disagree with the secular world on these elements. Okay, so God created it this way. This is the world today. No one argues about this. It's fractured. So the crust, that outer layer, is not one monolithic, solid piece. It's actually a mosaic of broken pieces called plates. You may have heard of tectonic plates. That's what these are. They're floating, free-floating on the asthenosphere, and they can move, and they are moving right now. It's just a few inches a year at the moment, but they are moving. Okay, some continents are getting closer to each other, some are getting spread apart. It's happening. But it wasn't always like that. This is where we deviate from the secular scientist. We've talked about God's perfect creation, the world. It was one monolithic crust then. There were no cracks in it. It was solid. There were no earthquakes, no volcanoes, none of that. There were no natural disasters in that creation. We went over that, I think, session 2. But now it's fractured. It was fractured at the flood. What we have now is a remnant of the flood. Whenever you hear of an earthquake or volcanoes, these are the aftermath of the flood. It's winding down. It's going away. If the Lord tarried, the planet would eventually completely cool all the way to its core. There'd be no magnetic field. There'd be no life long before that. So what we have today is really the aftermath of the flood. It fits. Secular science has taken what we have today and extrapolated that, well, must have been 4.5 billion years ago, and these things have been going on forever. But the Bible tells us a different story, and I'm going to try and show you that that story is the true one, scientifically. So let's go back to the year 1656 from creation. This is the year of the flood. We can get that from all the dates given to us in the Bible. God's very clear on chronology, okay? Like Aaron brought up this morning, he's a God of order. And he's given us what we need to know dates, okay? So 1656, if you're outside the planet looking down, all's right with the world, right? No issues. If you're to land on the planet, we got a whole lot of evil going on and things like that. But from a planetary standpoint, we've got the megacontinent, low elevation, shallow seas, warm temperate climate, vapor canopy around it, giving the greenhouse effect, so North and South Pole are comfortable. You know, we found tropical forest fossils all over the planet, including there. And so we have this wonderful temperate climate, even after the fall. Then something starts to happen. Starts in the center of the oceans. Okay, there's something going on this day. Verse 7:11. So look at this. You don't see this in the Bible much. I don't think anywhere else except the flood. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Aaron. But God says in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month. It's pretty specific, right? Don't believe anywhere else in the Bible they're telling us the exact day. God wants us to know specifically the timing of these flood events. I believe the reason is so we can take the aftermath, what we have now, and we study with science, and correlate it with everything that happened during the flood. Okay? Because he's going to keep doing this and telling us this day, this day, this day, and this month, and all of this. In the handout I'm going to give you at the end, this table here, when you look at it, you'll see, oh, these are all the events of the flood and the specific day and month and year, because the flood goes on for a little over a year, and the durations of all of these events. The Bible gives us all this. It's got all the Bible references here for that, okay? So God's very specific. This is a big deal for some reason. And I think it's to be able to have no excuse when we take the evidence that we've been given, his revelation of creation that we can study through science, and see this fits hand in glove with what he told us. And I can tell you now it does. And I think I'm going to make a pretty good case here that that's the truth. All right, so something's starting to go on this particular day. Crack. A crack heard around the world, out in the ocean. A crack about 25,000 miles long, all the way around, in the oceanic crust. Remember, we talked about the crust, that outer layer. It's been cracked. Okay? So God says the same day, the day we just spoke of, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. We're going to talk about both of those. So we have two dynamics at play for the flood. We've got the great deep broken up, and we've got the windows of heaven opened. So let's talk about the great deep first, since we're in the ocean with this picture. So what does this mean? What specifically happened regarding these fountains of the deep? I always thought, well, is there some sort of pressurized water underneath, and that, somehow it busted free and is coming up? And that's totally wrong. So there's going to be a whole lot of stuff going on here, and I'm going to go piece by piece, but all this stuff is happening simultaneously, right? So we have this crack in the planet, through the oceans, all the way around. And so, speaking of the crust, that outer layer, like crust on bread, you've got an oceanic crust and a continental crust. You can imagine which one's where. Under the ocean, that crust is cold. It's got thousands of feet of seawater over it. It's cold, and because of that, it's contracted and it's dense. It's denser than the continental crust, which is warmer, right? Warm things expand, cold things contract. So what this is doing is enabling the oceanic crust to start to quite frankly. But it's making this, and it's going to end up coming up somewhere. Has to. So this is the first volcanic activity on the planet. Is being caused by this runaway subduction, that friction, creating all this heat. There's all this magma underneath the ground and the continental stuff, and it's going to work its way up. Some places it's coming up fast. Some places it might take 300 years, 1,000 years. But it's going to come up, okay? And that's going to play an important role when we get into things a little bit later. Thank you. This is another picture of it, sorry. You can hardly see it here, but you can see it's moving the same way, and it's deep diving into the mantle here and leaving a trench. My able assistant here has a 3D globe, okay? Not just the land, but it has the oceans in it. 3D. This is actual where we are today. I put tape on here, and if you look at this, when she hands it around, you're going to see these subduction trenches all over the world. Okay? So where the plate has moved and subducted under the continent, you end up with a trench. Right here. Here's a trench. Very deep. Look at these. They're amazing. Super deep. Right near the continent. So this is all fact. This is all geology. You know, everyone agrees on this. This is happening. The secular scientists think, well, this has happened slowly forever. But we believe we can show, no, this happened 4,400 years ago, all at once, and changed the face of the planet from what we had to what we have now. Now, like I said, there's a whole lot of stuff happening simultaneously, and you may already be thinking ahead. Well, some other stuff's got to be going on. Well, that's going around. We've got all this molten lava from all this friction of the subduction from the mantle, from the asthenosphere, coming up to fill the void where these ocean plates are moving apart, right? Now the peanut butter is able to come up. It's got a spot to come. And it's going to be filling this, and this stuff is molten magma. So what do you think it's going to run into? Thank you. All right. So what's it going to hit? It's going to hit seawater. So when that magma hits that seawater, boom, boom, on a global scale. I mean, this blows my mind, can't wrap my mind around it. 25,000 miles of this happening. It's a linear curtain all the way around the planet of supersonic speed, superheated steam going straight up to the top of the atmosphere, all the way around the planet. So these plates move. Here comes stuff to fill it, and it is blazing hot, and it hits this water, and you just got an explosion of superheated steam skyrocketing, catapulting up to the very extent of the atmosphere. And you know what's up there is the vapor canopy. And it's going to have that precipitate. And you're going to have, I can't even call it rain, because it's not going to be drops. It's going to be like under a waterfall. With this stuff, with the amount of moisture from a 25,000 mile stream of this, and it's widening, right? There's going to be a whole new seafloor. As this stuff, you know, this conveyor belt runaway subduction takes the old floor away and fills it up with magma. It's just vaporizing the ocean into the air. And that's got to come back down. It's just like having buckets poured on top of you. Does that make sense? So God says, all the fountains of the great deep broken up. That's what we just went through, the crack. And the windows of heaven were open. The majority of the water is coming up from the ocean into the air, but we've got water up there in that vapor canopy that give the great greenhouse effect, where even the north-south pole have got tropics, and that's collapsing too. Here's the basic dynamics of the flood. And the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So this went on for that length of time. Just an immense inundation of rain, but really torrents, just buckets coming down. But that's not all of it. There's more going on. So this will take a little explaining. This oval is the world's top simulation of these dynamics of the flood plate tectonics, done on one of the world's most powerful supercomputers. This is day 15 of the flood it's showing. So we're going to walk through that. But let's talk about this first. You've seen that picture from the first session. It's not just a random choice. That is a simulation of what the planet looked like based on geological evidence from this simulation. It wasn't just a random choice, let's come up with something and use that. No, that comes from this simulation. So this is day 15. So while these steam jets are going, okay, we're day 15 into the rain. And there's still other stuff going on, so it's hard for me to put this together because there's too much at once. But this upheaval and this plate tectonics and the subduction is breaking apart the supercontinent. And look what the simulation's showing. This is North America. Here. This is Florida. This is what's going to be the Atlantic Ocean. This is South America. This is Africa. Madagascar. Antarctica. Australia. India. Europe, Eurasia, all one. Greenland. So we started with the cracks in the ocean, but now all this upheaval is just breaking this continent into pieces. Okay, and again, it's floating on the asthenosphere. It's starting to move. It's moving the most right here between this eastern coast of Africa and the eastern coast of the US. and this the Gulf of Mexico. You maybe can't see these arrows, but the way Africa is going to move, if I've got Africa right here, it's going to go like this. And South America here, it's going to go like this and move down. North America is going to move up that way. Asia is going to come down. India is going to move way up here and attach to Asia. Antarctica headed down, and so on. This map is 40 miles down, and the colors indicate temperature. And so you can see this is one of those main rifts, they call it, in the ocean. The magma's coming up, it's making new ocean floor and all of that. The steam's coming out of it, the superjets of steam and all that. But all these continents now, this continent's being broken up, floating on the asthenosphere, and moving apart. Everybody's with me? All right, cool. Now there's something else happening at the same time. So now we're back to the ocean, right? And that magma's coming up out through it, and it's building up the new ocean floor. That ocean floor is real hot, right? It's not like the old ocean floor that was real cool with the water sitting on it. It's real hot. It's rising. It's expanding relative to the previous old ocean floor because of the heat. And the simulation model I just showed you said it's rising 1,000 feet, it's rising 2,000 feet, it's rising 3,300 feet at the maximum. That's taking all that ocean water that hasn't been into steam jets and throwing it to the sides. That's what's showing here. Here's that rift right down the middle, the initial crack. And these are tidal waves going both ways from this as this ocean floor rises relative to the old floor due to its high temperature. We have the world's hugest, by a mile, tsunami, tidal wave. It's going to inundate the continent, which is breaking into pieces at the same time. So not only do we have these buckets falling, we have these waves, and not ordinary waves. If you remember the first picture from the intro of the whole session, had a picture of a tidal wave taking over the earth? Yeah, that's part of this. That initial tidal wave had to be enormous. So here's a picture of it in another way. You can see the floor lifting and just throwing water both ways. The whole ocean. We're not talking about one spot. Like we have earthquakes now, it's in one spot, or maybe it's a few miles long or something. We're talking all the way around the planet. When God does something, he does it and then some. So it says, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth. And I can't read it, my horrible font. And the ark went up upon the face of the waters. So we got a tsunami now coming. The rain's been going a few days. I think the ark would have been destroyed if it had been built on the coast. It would have just been toppled over and over and over again and broken into bits, everything killed. it was built at the gate of Eden, my opinion. Remember the Sethites, the godly line, the messianic line, would all live near there where the physical manifestation of God is. The Canaanites would say, why bother here? There's greener pastures. We got a whole world to go to. But the godly line's going to stay near where Adam and Eve were. And remember, they lived for 2/3 of this pre-flood world. Almost 1,000 years old. And we're at the year 1656. So their offspring would have probably stayed right there to do worship to God, to honor God, like Adam and Eve did, and taught their children to. Noah was part of that line. He must have built the ark there. You remember the Garden of Eden is on the mountain of God, the highest elevation on the planet, the uplands, about this elevation where Belag is. At that time, in that world as created, was about the highest elevation. Okay, 2,500 feet, something like that. That would have spared the ark from these tidal waves, which wouldn't have just been one. Take years for that huge thing to finally settle down. Not to mention at the same time, you've got all this tectonics and this mountain building and these continents getting ripped apart and everything else that's going on. So that ark was built at a high elevation, saving it from that initial tidal wave and then the subsequent tides from that. Just keep sloshing around back and forth. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered, 15 cubits upward, and the water prevailed, and the mountains were covered. Everything was covered. So if you're in space and you're looking at the planet, it looked like the ball of water from session 1. Everything covered. Now the high hills, we don't have the original creation anymore. At the same time, all these mountains are being built now. These plate tectonics are doing that. We don't know the depth. But if you remember from either the first or second session, if we took the earth and flattened all the mountains down and brought up all the seabeds so it was a perfectly round ball, there's enough water on the planet right now, the depth of the water would be 1.5 miles. A lot of water. With the flood, we don't think any water was added. Didn't need to be. Some people speculate, well, a huge asteroid of ice came and added all this water. No, it was all here already. So if we flattened it into a complete sphere, like a beach ball, the water would be 1.5 miles deep, the water that's on the planet now. So there's plenty of water. So we don't know the height of those hills at this point. We don't know. It's going to be a lot higher than that 2,500-foot elevation that was calculated for Eden. Remember, that came from, well, it's not going to be in the clouds, and the clouds are misting on the coasts, and you can calculate all this through meteorology. All the sciences are covered pretty much in this Bible account. You know, as you go through them, I started listing them for next week, and I need to add meteorology to it. Okay, anyways, 15 cubits, if you remember from last week, cubits about 18 inches. It's about 25 feet to the tallest peak at that moment on the planet. Again, we don't know that height. So what's going on now? These are separating more. I wish I had day 40 of this simulation. I don't, only day 15. But these things are separated. All the continents are separating wildly now, right? And we're going to talk about a particular one. You see India here? Well, if you look at the globe, what's it doing down there? Because right here, there's India. It's attached to Asia. Not here. It's not attached. It's got a long ways to go. India, you see the arrows going this way. And like I mentioned earlier, Eurasia up here coming down. These two are coming at each other, and not in slow fashion. We're talking feet per second, a lot of feet per second, into the greatest collision, maybe in the solar system, but certainly on Earth. This Indian-Australian plate that was way down here, and this Eurasian plate way up here, are coming together at what is estimated to be 90 feet per second each. This room's about 40 feet. That means it's moving from there to here, probably into the baptismal in a half a second. Each plate. That's 62 miles per hour. This one's moving 62, this one's moving 62, and they're going to collide. And they're going to buckle that rock strata into the world's tallest mountains, the Himalayas. Right here. That collision had to rock this planet where that axis that the moon is holding nice stable is swinging like this. And that's throwing this water around even more. This planet's in chaos when that happens. God has to be watching out for these people. I don't know if you've ever been in a boat in a bad storm. I have. It's horrifying. For them to be on that ark when this stuff's happening like this has to be unimaginable. This picture does not do it justice. I could not find a picture of two cars hitting each other at 62 miles each, per hour each. This is like 35, head-on collision. There'd be nothing left, that's a car hitting a block wall at 124 miles an hour. What would be left of it? The back bumper would be with the front bumper. And it drove those mountains up. And this is happening all over the planet to lesser degrees. These mountains we're in, same thing. Being pushed up like this from this remnant of the flood, of all this tectonic plate movement. So the axis is wobbling as this is happening. And our axis was perfectly perpendicular to our orbit about the sun, so we had no seasons before. And the angular momentum, the spinning of the Earth, that angular momentum with all this stuff sloshing around and these collisions and everything else being changed and swinging it wildly from where it was. And it settled here thanks to the moon, still there doing its job, right? It's the most dense thing in the solar system, very tight orbit, circular orbit, helping to maintain that axis so it doesn't swing. There'd be no Earth or no life if the Earth was perpetually unstable on its axis. Not possible. So it stabilizes finally at its current 23.5 degrees tilt relative to the sun. And this is so monumental, this collision and all this tectonics going, it changes our orbit around the sun. God's a God of order and perfection when he created it. 360 perfect 24-hour days and 0 seconds to revolve around the sun. 360. 12 months and 30 days. Wouldn't that be great? If every month was 30 days, you don't have to remember that poem. I never learned it. I got to look it up on my phone. Is there 31 days in September? I don't know. God created it that way. This angular momentum change swings it out into this crazy 365 1/4 days to revolve around the sun. That's what we believe happened with this because of the magnitude of the forces at play and how they can alter the angular momentum of the spinning Earth on its axis. So you can see how we're a remnant of the Earth originally created. It's created perfect. Now it's been fractured. 2 huge events in the history of man. The biggest, well, you have to put in Jesus, of course, but in terms of up to this point, the fall changed everything. As man's kicked out of the garden, scarred it, corrupted everything. And then the extent of evil that God could no longer stand on the planet for the second biggest event up to this point, the flood. Into a fractured world, which it still is. A fractured set of plates that are trying to heal themselves. It's diminishing. But again, every time we hear of an earthquake or a volcano, it can be a reminder of God's action with the flood. It's directly from it. And God says, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and the creeping things and the fowl of the heaven, and they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and that they were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed 150 days. So, I should have mentioned earlier that just prior to the flood, it's estimated the world population was from 1 to 4 billion people. We have 8 billion now, and that's with a B. And before the flood, we had from 1 to 4 billion, with most people coming down on the high end. 4 billion people. It's a lot of people. Okay. And they were all wiped out, except, of course, Noah and his family. And the reason the great population explosion in 1,600 years, you know, when you're living to 100 and you can have children for 300, when you model that, it's like, gee whiz, we're going to have a big population fast. Okay, so the waters prevailed for 150 days. And there's that picture of that tidal wave coming over the megacontinent. The word for prevailed in Hebrew is gabar, which has the idea of conquering. The water conquered the world completely. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged, which means lessened. They didn't go away, but they're lessened. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped. So day 40, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned, so drained off of the earth continually. And after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated, which doesn't mean gone away, but lessened. Okay, so now we're on the downhill part of the water level. The estimate is the high water level was at 60 days in. Okay, the rain stopped at 40, but it kept increasing through all these other dynamics going on. A high water mark around day 60. And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day. Again, very specific. This picture does not do it justice. We still have violence on the top of the water. But the ark rested. And I've run aground. I've had boats. I've run aground many times. And what usually happens is you run aground and then you break free and you run aground, you break free, you run aground. I suspect that's what was happening with these successive waves coming. They hit ground, move a little bit, until you finally get locked somewhere you can't move any longer. But no land was visible when this happened. Okay? It's just water from the vantage point of the ark. You could have had other places on earth where the mountains are showing. Upon the mountains of Ararat. Now in the Bible, there's also a country or a region called Ararat. 3 places. I remember Kings. I'm not sure of the other 2. But it's an area. Probably not the mountains today that we know of as Ararat. This is a picture. That's the big one is Mount Ararat, and then there's small Mount Ararat. Those were both active volcanoes. God wouldn't have had them land on top of a volcano, or what was going to become a volcano. I don't think. And so the modern day mountains of Ararat probably doesn't pertain. It's more about the ark landed in the area called Ararat, the mountains of Ararat in that region. There's been research. Bill Krause, like the expert on this, quoting him, he says, the best ancient historical sources are in relative agreement about the landing place of the ark. Pagan, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources all point to the southern location of Kudida. That's a mountain range in southern Turkey near the border of Syria and Iraq. This is 200 miles south of what today is called Mount Ararat. And in that area, that would have been the mountains of Ararat. And amongst other sources that he quotes, he cites Josephus. We talked about him, Flavius Josephus, a historian, a Jewish historian, worked for the Romans. He had access to all the library stuff and everything. The Romans paid him to do research. And he's known to be accurate, pretty accurate. He says, and this is in the 1st century AD, then the ark settled on the mountaintop in Armenia. This is Ararat. The Armenians call that spot the landing place, for it was there that the ark came safe to land, and they, the locals, show the relics of it to this day. So he's claiming in the 1st century AD that if you went to this Kudida area, in the towns, they're going to show you relics from the ark that's nearby. It's not in the Bible, don't know. But it fits. And there are trips to go through. And there are pictures of stuff, but I don't know. You like to travel. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. So this is months after they landed. And in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So when they landed, there were months until they could see anything but water. So this is not a short event, the flood. Like on a casual read when I was younger, it's 40 days, 40 nights, it's over. We're going to see there's hundreds of years of stuff still happening, and it's still happening today. With all those cracks, this tectonic plate movement is part of this. We're still living it. So here, I've got this, mentioned it in the handout, but so the rain stopped on day 40. High water mark, we think, day 60. The ark rests on day 150, and they finally see something on day 224. So if you're on that ark, stuck with these animals, a lot of work, right? And you finally rest and you think, let's get off this thing. And you don't see any dry land for 74 more days. And then you're just starting to see something else out there. And remember, the water's coming and going too. Still very dangerous. You wouldn't want to leave that ark. There's the ark. I tried to put it up there on Mount Kudida. It has a nice flat top to it. So now, and in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. Not the whole earth, just here. They're in a relatively stable spot compared to what's going on elsewhere, and we'll go through that quickly in a minute. So they've been seeing dry earth now for a while. And God spoke to Noah. And before I get into that, think of this. They're cooped up on this ark. They're up there, I think it's 4 months since they landed now, till it's pretty dry all around, looks pretty safe. They could have been tempted to say, come on, let's get out of here, Dad. Come on. Tired of this, it looks safe. We've been out here on the deck looking every day, and it looks pretty good. And he had to have been saying, he's a very righteous man. Not many in the Bible where you can't say much bad about him. After the flood, he had an incident, right? Won't go into that. But he didn't do anything horrible. Probably telling his kids, no way. We're not leaving this thing until God tells us to leave this thing. You don't know what's coming. It could be another tidal wave. He's a very smart, wise man. So God spoke unto Noah. Finally, go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee, and bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee. Very clear instructions. Disembark, everybody. It's time. Noah, to his great credit, the first thing he does, and Noah built an altar unto the Lord and took of every clean beast, remember there were 7, not 2 of the clean, and of every clean fowl, again 7. So he took some of the 7 and offered burnt offerings on the altar to God. And you can see here they're all praying to him. They took time to do that. Not only God honoring as they should, but just smart. And then God says, before I get into it, many think this is God instructing them that you're not where you used to be. This is not the perfect place I created that you were in before the flood. It's different. And God says, and while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So God's saying, now there's a time to plant. Before you could plant any time of the year, it doesn't matter. But now, no, there's a time to plant. And there's a time to harvest it. And there's going to be cold. And there's going to be winter with that. And there's going to be summer. And that's not going to end just like days and nights have been going on until the end of days. It's a new place you're in. No. That ends the biblical description of the flood. But, and I have no idea what time it is, but there's some more. The planet's not done. I'm going to go through this quickly as possible, because this is going to bring us to the current day. So you're going to get a whole picture of really the history of mankind as I go through these last steps of what's still happening to our planet after they've disembarked. Timeline, talked about that in the handout. So the flood is technically over, but the catastrophes are not. Let's quickly go through this. So we've got still upheaval around the globe of continents changing and things like this, and this water's still on it, and it's draining off, and it's carving out canyons and exposing the layers of deposition that occurred early in the flood, right? You can see wherever a cut's made in a road, like I-26 up here, you can see layers in it. And so at this point, there's no vegetation to hold any ground. And there hasn't been time for any of these deposition layers to harden. They're loose. And so this water draining off is creating huge canyons and basically carving the landscape around the world. Some more examples of it, just carving it out as this water's draining, and it's still sloshing back and forth, in and out and in and out, but carving these canyons, exposing deposition layers that are thousands of feet thick. So imagine the waves that came with, and it's not water really, it's water filled with stuff, with mud and junk like that, and it's depositing all that and laying down a whole bunch of stuff that's thousands of feet thick in a single pass, and then receding with the more of the water and less of the dirt leaving. And then it's leaving, it's taking some with it, and it's picking up more elsewhere and bringing it. You can see a pattern in geology. These are called mega sequences, where the first pass is rocky rubble. And then as the layers go up, they become more fine and more fine, and somehow there's more rocks in the next mega sequence that have been picked up. Boulders, huge. And on up, more silt, and more rocks again. These deposition layers that had to be done in a catastrophic event. It doesn't happen over time. These perfect interfaces would have eroded if there were millions of years between them. Perfect deposition layers. Perfect intersections between them, which would be what we expect in this sort of event. Now, look at this. These were laid flat. Okay? Gravity, depositing all this yuck and mud in layers flat. We still got these tectonic forces at play, jamming this up before it's hardened, where it's flexible, and just jamming it up. This stuff's still going on for decades after the flood. Here, it busted, and one side sheared up over the other one is just being pushed over the other set of layers. Look at this accordion-like thing. Imagine the forces at play. If we're on the planet near this, when this is happening, these tectonic forces just crumpling this like an accordion. It's still soft because it's pliable and flexible. It's not breaking like it was already hardened into stone. Mud turns into stone. It happens eventually. It can be very quick, depending on the mineral content and the temperatures and pressures and things like that, or it can be slower, but there's lots of evidence stuff turns to stone fast. So all this stuff's going on for decades after technically the flood is over. And remember the planet, 1,656 years of foliage growth, tree growth, under that vapor canopy, and it's growing everywhere on land. Huge trees, tropical forests everywhere, very thick and lush. Well, all that's been wiped out. Most of it's been buried and has turned into coal, which also can happen very quickly in a couple thousand years. Becomes our coal beds. But a lot of it's still left on the surface of the water, floating. In fact, between continents, you could walk with all the junk floating in the oceans once this stuff settled down 100 years later. And we have unstable continents. So you could have water that couldn't drain because it's filled in like a lake, and more tectonics break that free like a dam breaking. This was happening all over the place. And here comes more erosion. This is Psalm 104. I'm not going to read it because it's hard to read. But it's basically talking about the flood and how the waters are receding and going back to where they were originally. Day 3, God separated the seas from the dry land. He's putting the seas back to where they belong in this part of the timing. Taking decades, though, after the flood to do so. We've got very warm seabeds still. And we've got a whole lot of volcanic activity that's blocking sunlight. So we have a cool atmosphere and very warm oceans, and that's the recipe for superstorms. They call them hypercanes. They could cover a whole hemisphere in one storm, dumping immense amounts of rain. You know, we've all experienced hurricanes even here that have come this far, and we're not getting the brunt of it, but the amount of water that they can dump is amazing. And now you're talking about something that makes ours look, our hurricanes look like nothing. Dumping so much water and eroding stuff. So this is happening for 100 years after the flood. That happened at Mount St. Helens. Recent volcanic activity. And water got dammed up and finally broke through and created an immense canyon. I think they call it the Little Grand Canyon. It's enormous, showing what a lot of water can do very quickly. The secular scientists contend the Grand Canyon, this was very slow, took tens of millions of years of this little river coming through. No. This was a catastrophic event, probably dammed up water that came through there when there's no plant life to hold everything together, and it's still soft, and push that all out to sea. For 100 years after the end of the flood, volcanism is off the chart. We know this for a fact. Everyone does. Because they can do ice cores, okay? And they can look back thousands of years. And we're only 4,400 years away from the flood right now. And whatever's in the air settles on the surface of the snow and gets buried with new snow. And that process keeps going, and you can tell what's in the air over thousands of years. The volcanic ash at the time of the flood was immense. This is just to explain, we sort of went over this before, of why we have all these volcanoes. It goes back to the subduction and all this stuff. That's what the world in lots of places looked like 100 years after the flood. So this is ice core data from the flood to the maximum of the ice age. It's about 300 years showing here. And this is the amount of volcanism. This is the aerosols that landed in the snow I just spoke of, and where they can plot it in terms of volcanic activity. And you can see where it was right after, and it's just diminishing down, and we still have it today. If we continued this chart, it would be coming down, down, down. Things are still settling out from the flood. All that volcanic ash for 100 years going up and cooling the planet. It's not like the greenhouse vapor canopy, which was clear and the sunlight could come through. No, the volcanic ash is like we had these fires in Canada. And if you're at a high elevation, we can sort of see over to Bald Mountain. You know, those cloudy days? Some days it looked like it was raining. It was so thick, but it was particles in the air, aerosols from the fires. Same thing from the volcanoes. That's going on for 100 years on a scale nothing like today, causing an ice age. About a third of the planet's covered with glaciers at the peak of the ice age. Some places like North America, the glaciation came to a lower latitude. Other places it's a little higher, but it was affecting the planet. I've always wondered, well, I don't remember anything in the Bible suggesting an ice age. How does this fit in? So here's the Mediterranean. At the maximum peak of the ice age, this line, everything above it up in here, was completely frozen and glaciated over. The Baltic Sea up here, completely frozen. The North Sea, all this completely frozen. The English Channel, frozen. Irish Sea, frozen. Germany, Austria, all in here, completely under glaciers. The UK, their tallest mountain's like 4,000 feet. I looked it up today. They're all covered with snow. It's not a glacier there, but it's cold. And then it stops. That little dot, that's where the ark landed, that area. They probably didn't know of the ice age. It affected them in that summer temperatures were cooler, but this would have been normal to them. But precipitation was great. Got all this moisture, more precipitation, more rain there. You may remember in the Bible that Solomon and David took the cedars of Lebanon, the great forest in Lebanon of cedar trees, which don't exist today. It's desert. That precipitation probably grew all those cedar forests that they used to build the temple and palaces that they had. Sought after wood. Now when they left the ark, going north would be a mistake. You see all that snow up there. It's just more mountains all the way to the Black Sea. You couldn't be at the elevation the ark landed on during the Ice Age. couldn't survive it, be so cold. They headed down into this area, which is the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. This is where Babel is. Okay? That's where they settled. Now, the Tigris and Euphrates are not the Tigris and Euphrates mentioned in the Garden of Eden. You know, Noah lived 500 some years after the flood. He probably named these rivers. They're like the rivers I know of that I saw coming out of the garden. He didn't have access to the garden, but he could see the rivers coming out of them that it talks about. And so they're different rivers, but named after what he thought were similar ones. And so they settle here, very rich valley. Just to give you an idea of the impact of the Ice Age, in some other places, this is Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. It's the fourth tallest peak in the world, 19,000 feet. Today, the snow cover's down to like 19 or 16,000 on average. At the peak of the Ice Age, they estimate about 13,000. It would have been pretty pleasant in Africa at the cooler temperatures than they are these days. And then the glaciation retreated to about where it is today. And this is where it is today. It fluctuates decade to decade, of course. Okay, so let's review. 1656, we get cracks in the ocean. That starts this runaway subduction where the crustal plates are subducting under the continental plates, pulling apart in the ocean that's being filled with magma, hitting the water, causing incredible amounts of moisture thrown up into the atmosphere, collapsing the vapor canopy and causing tremendous rain. The ocean floors are rising because they're hot, displacing the ocean water, causing tsunamis to come over the planet. We have plate tectonics that are crashing at high speeds, creating mountain ranges like the Himalayas, throwing the whole globe off tilter and swinging it around like crazy, changing angular momentum, changing the circular rotation around the sun. And then after that, we've got the reshaping of the earth through all this drainage of water, taking away this soft deposition layers here or there. The 100 years of volcanism, that's off the chart. Superstorms, because of the volcanism, is blocking the sun, cool air, warm oceans, incredible storms, dropping so much water and rain and wind, and it's reshaping continents too. Then we end up to the Ice Age, and glaciers are reshaping continents like the Great Plains of North America and bringing us to our world of today. So that's everything. And I put it in, and it's in the handout. I calculated 6,026 years. It could be plus or minus 20. Only because when they say Noah was born this year, it could have been early in the year or late in the year. You add up enough people, you get a little bit off. But we start with Creation Week. We covered that in session 1 and 2. We've got the patriarchs in the antediluvian world, living outside the Garden Gate. We've got the post-flood chaos. So here's the flood. 1656, 100 years of volcanism. It's just off the chart, and that causes 300 years of the Ice Age. It wasn't tens of millions of years like the others say. This stuff happened fast. During the Ice Age is Babel. Babel's right in the middle of Mesopotamia. I don't know much about that yet, and I'm very interested because it looks like the evolution of language is like so much on the biblical side. It's like a slam dunk. I want to get into how language developed, both theories, and see how the Bible lays that out. There's really something there, I think, when it comes to Babel. So I put that there. And then you've got Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and then a whole bunch of kings and judges up to Jesus. And then the church age, and oh, look at there. That's best church in the area, isn't it? So next week, it's the finale. I'm going to bring it all together. Okay, so I've gone all the way through to where we are today, and now it's going to be the evidence that we have on the planet today. There are going to be a lot of fossils, a lot of dinosaur stuff involved with that, because that's the geological record. We're going to go into all those sediment layers and learn about that and what's in them and what it tells us about a young Earth, and try and make that case that this place is 6,000 years old, just like God says. Okay, that's everything I got. A little quicker than normal.